Hi, I'm Reverend Wendy Craig-Purcell here at the Unity Center in San Diego. Thank you so much for watching today. If you'd like to support the work that we do here, please consider making a contribution. Go to our website. It's easy to do. Thank you in advance for that contribution.
Reverend Wendy presents a talk that explores and expresses the truths of unity, and that there are real-world practical things that we can do to deepen our experience of spirituality and help us in our daily lives.
So if you weren't with us last week, we started a new series. It's a 7-part series, and I am calling it 7 Spiritual Sticking Points. And it kind of pulls from 2 very different ideas or 2 very different sources. One is one that I remember learning about in ministerial school. It was a teaching that has its roots in the 4th century through a monk by the name of Ponticus, and he had defined 7 deadly sins. And those sins he defined were these: pride, greed, lust, envy, gluttony, wrath, and sloth. We didn't spend a whole lot of time in ministerial school talking about those things, but we looked at them from the standpoint of what are attitudes and behaviors that can cause us to feel a separation from spirit, or that get in our way of being all that we really can be as divine, beautiful beings. The other source is a book that I found a number of years ago. It's actually a novel. I don't read very many novels, and it's a novel based in the recovery movement and recovery teachings. It's a book written by Edward Bear, and it is his journey in looking at what he calls 7 deadly sins. And he identifies those, and these are the ones we're going to be looking at: the need to know, the need to be right, the need to get even, the need to look good, the need to judge, the need to keep score, and the need to be in control. Well, today we're going to look at the need to be right. Say that with me. The need to be right. The need to be right. And just notice when you hear those words, what comes up for you. It might be like you feel like, uh-oh, I'm looking at myself if I'm honest, when I think about the need to be right. Or, boy, I'm wishing so-and-so were sitting in this room right now because they could really use this lesson. Or I hope so-and-so is really listening to this. So just notice what comes up around the words. The need to be right. Now, I've said that we're going to look at these because they are spiritual sticking points. I define a spiritual sticking point as any behavior or any attitude that results in an impasse that keeps me from growing spiritually and from healing spiritually. It is my belief that we come into a teaching such as Unity or the Science of Mind because we want to grow spiritually. It is my belief that we come into this teaching and we stay with this teaching because we have a desire to awaken spiritually. And in that process of awakening spiritually, sometimes we see things in our past or even in our current state of being that we know need to be changed or need to be healed or need to be released. So sticking points are those things that keep us from being successful in waking up. So the spiritual sticking point of the need to be right, the need to be right. Do you know anyone who needs to be right all the time? Raise your hand if you know anyone who needs, bless you, to be right all the time. Okay, I do too. Do you know anyone who seems to have as their mission on earth correcting everyone and everything? Raise your hand if you have anybody like that in your life. Do you know anyone who can never admit that they are wrong? All right. And how about, do you know anyone who can never apologize? They just can't. They choke on the words, I'm sorry. Raise your hand. Raise your hand. Alrighty, raise your hand if your hand went up to any one of those. Come on. It's just about unanimous in the room, isn't it? Then you can probably relate to this piece I want to read to you from Edward Bear. I swear I could have written this piece, but I didn't. When I was young, I was always trying to prove that my father was wrong, primarily because he was always right, or claimed that he was. Got to be a very important part of my life. So I'd try to trap him, catch him in a lie, maybe mispronouncing a word. I'd get the dictionary out and show him that he was mispronouncing the word. Show him right there in the dictionary, black and white. But he'd say the dictionary was wrong. Old edition, he'd say. So I'd get a newer edition. He'd say that the word was typically pronounced the way he pronounced it because of the regional flavor. And that long usage had made his pronunciation correct, regardless of what the dictionary said. He could never be wrong. So I developed such a powerful need to be right. I find those last words quite insightful. He could never be wrong. So I developed such a powerful need to be right. For many, if we have the need to be right, it's really a coping mechanism of protection. And we're going to unpack that a little bit. It's really a coping mechanism of protection. So we're going to look at the why we have a need to be right. We're going to look at where the need comes from. We're going to look at what the need to be right really looks like in expression, and it's not usually a very pretty sight. And we're going to look at what the need to be right does, what the consequences of this need is in our lives, and then we'll take a quick look at how can we get unstuck? How can we get unstuck? Now, it's important that we understand there's a difference between a need and a want, or a need and a preference. A need is something that we can not live without. Can you live without being right? Yes, yes. Because the truth is, every single one of us in this room, whether we will ever admit it or not, have been wrong before. And yet we're still here, right? So it's not a need. It's not a need. Do we have a preference to be right? Yeah, it's kind of nice to be right, right? It can feel good to be right. It can be a preference, but preferences have a very different qualitative feel both in the giving and in the receiving. The problem isn't when we have a preference for something. It's when we have a demand, when we have a need, when we are addicted to that way of being or that behavior. So why do we have a need to be right? Why do you think you have a need to be right or people have a need to be right? What is it about being right? Afraid. Right, we're afraid. We are afraid that we might be wrong. And how does being wrong typically feel? Not good. Keeping it very simple. Being wrong usually doesn't feel particularly good. We're afraid of being embarrassed, maybe. We're afraid maybe of being teased. We may be afraid of being humiliated. We may be afraid of losing face or losing control, losing power, right? Losing power. Somehow I think we equate being right with being good. Turn that over for just a moment. Equating being right with being good. Think about school for a moment. Traditional school. What do we prize our kids on? Getting the what answer? The right answer. Now, I'm not suggesting we should change that and it should just let them get all the wrong answers. I'm not suggesting that. But I think that if we just stay with that level, we're missing something. Because it isn't always about getting the right answer. Because answers, the quality of our answers is directly tied to the value, the accuracy, the meaning, and the quality of the question being asked. So I think we need to value both of those. But part of the why of the need to be right is that in the deepest part of us, somehow we equate being right with being better or being good. Second, where the need comes from. I think it can come from unrealistic expectations. The need to be right can come from unrealistic expectations. The need to be right, the addiction to being right, can come from just what we saw modeled in our family of origin. If the only model we ever saw around us was people jockeying for a position to prove that they are right at all costs, no matter what happened to the relationship, then if that's the only thing we ever saw, we are not necessarily acquainted with what it looks like to still be a person of value, to still be healthy and whole, and be able to be vulnerable and say, I don't know. Or you know what, I was so convinced I was right, but guess what? I now realize I was wrong. If we never saw that modeled, we may have difficulty getting comfortable with modeling it and expressing it ourselves when it is a truthful thing to express. I think additionally, there's a certain amount of gender identification with the need to be right. I think we tend to hold, or men tend to hold that even stronger maybe than women do. That righthood is somehow associated with strength and intelligence and power and masculinity, and that to admit, I may be wrong, I may have made a really big mistake, might touch upon questioning one's own sense of power and authenticity as being a man. So where the need comes from is important for us to kind of drill down and understand about ourselves. People who are addicted to being right usually are desperately trying to prove or protect themselves. People who are addicted to being right are usually trying desperately to prove or protect themselves, to prove that they are worthy and they are good enough, or to protect themselves from some of those things we talked about before, being embarrassed or being humiliated or ashamed. Don Miguel Ruiz, in his book, The Four Agreements, wrote, "We learn to be right and to make everyone else wrong. The need to be right is a result of trying to protect the image we want to project outside." So what does the need to be right look like? I don't think that the need to be right looks very attractive, to be honest with you. When I've watched around me and when I've noticed in myself a real digging in with the need to be right, it never looks attractive to me. It never looks loving or kind to me. It looks and feels to me very off-putting. Think of the last time you witnessed a conversation with two people both insisting that they were right. What did that look like? Probably not a very pleasant sight, right? And what did it sound like? Anger, right? And beneath anger is usually what emotion? Fear. Beneath anger is usually the emotion of fear. I remember many years ago sitting in church listening to my minister, he's no longer with us, Reverend Robert Stevens, who was the minister of Christ Church Unity, as it was called then, in San Diego. And he was reading from a book called The Vagabond Poet. And the book was written by Don Blanding. And though I was not married at the time, this particular poem stuck with me. And I want to share it with you because whether you're married or not, it fits in any kind of relationship context and kind of describes what happens and what it looks like, this need to be right. It's called the eternal triangle. Marriage, my dear, is a triangle. Your angle, our angle, my angle. And the usual cause when we do wrangle is a question of I, us, or you angle. I object when you say that the sure angle of our angle ought to be your angle. When I know that a right angle triangle must be based on a right angle, my angle. And then the fight begins. Right? And then the fight begins. Excuse me. So this idea of what it looks like when we are stuck in this place of having to be right. Having to be right. Those of you in a committed relationship maybe can relate to this. Have you ever had a conversation with your partner and you know you had the conversation? You know you said something to them or asked them to do something. You're absolutely positive you did. and you share that with the other, and they say, no, you never told me that. Raise your hand if you've ever been in that conversation. Have you ever been in that conversation for a long period of time where you are so positive? I mean, you're about to say, I would risk my life on the fact that I told you X, Y, Z, and the other is about to say the same thing. Raise your hand again if you know what it is that I'm talking about, right? Absolutely. I've been there. There is an advantage to having married someone for 2 years, then being divorced for 7, and John and I are about to celebrate our 30th next month. We see some of the same patterns, although we've gotten much better and faster at identifying them. And we don't get caught in them nearly the way we did in the first couple of years of marriage 1 or the first couple of years of marriage 2. But we were at a point in our relationship at one time where this was not an uncommon thing for us. Busy lives, convinced that you asked the other person to do something, convinced that you were very clear and they're just as convinced, no, you did not. No, you did not. And in one such occasion where I just knew I was right. And the truth is, I don't know now if I was or not. It doesn't matter. I watched just the energy of what was happening and just the pattern, right? It always falls into a certain kind of predictable pattern when you put out that kind of energy. And all of a sudden, what came to me was, Wendy practiced verbal Aikido. Now, that was something that I made up or I received. I'd never heard of the term verbal Aikido. Aikido is a martial art that is a totally non-resistant martial art. It's the only martial art, I used to practice it physically, it's the only martial art that doesn't teach you moves of attack, but teaches you how to respond to physical moves of attack by actually welcoming the energy in and very skillfully being able to transmute or turn that energy around so that the attacker is not harmed and you are not harmed either. It's it's a very complicated martial art, but a deeply spiritual martial art. And this idea of, I need to do some verbal Aikido here because what we're doing isn't working and I know the end result. And I said to John in that particular conversation, honey, maybe it was a phantom conversation. The words phantom came out. Maybe it was a phantom conversation. Maybe I was so convinced, I had it in my head and rehearsed it so many times that I convinced myself that I had it with you. And whether it was a real conversation or a phantom conversation or not, let's have the real conversation right here and right now. It became our code word, phantom conversation. Now, truly in those conversations, one is right and one is wrong, correct? Right? Truly, somebody would know if they had been watching who said what to whom and who didn't. But there's a point in our relationships, there's a point in our connecting with others where we have a choice to either practice holding on to and insisting that we are right, or making a different choice. Making a choice for peace, making a choice for the relationship, making a choice for love. And when it is a conscious choice, we grow in the process of that choice. And when it is a conscious choice, the relationship itself is strengthened and blessed by it in a way that arguing and proving with one winning and the other losing can never ever result in that. What it looks like is not just the need to be right, it can also look like the need to correct. Now, I don't know about you, but when I go to the doctor, I want my doctor's diagnosis to be correct. I want my doctor to be right. When I go to our tax CPA person, I want him to be correct. I want him to be right. When I go to an attorney, if I need one, I want his advice and counsel to be right. I want it to be correct. But is it necessary for everything in our life to be correct? Is it? No. No. Some things just don't matter. Say that with me. Some things just don't matter. Again, some things just don't matter. It's true. Some things just don't matter. When you see a child running down the hallway, a little child with a pair of scissors, that matters. You go correct that child, right? You take those scissors away from them. But part of our spiritual growth and healing is spiritual discernment. Being able to really know and discern what truly matters and what we can let go of. The consequence, here's the fourth one, of what happens, what it does, this need, this addiction to being right, it erodes our peace of mind. It damages our relationships. It can ruin our careers. Who wants to work with a know-it-all? Any of you want to work with or for a know-it-all? Somebody that can never be wrong? Absolutely not. What it also does is it stifles our learning. Stay with me on this one because I think this is a really, really important one. When we are so convinced we are right, our minds shut down to anything new and different. I think I'm describing right now what's going on in our country. I really do. What concerns me far more than the fact that we might have very different political points of view in our country, in our room, in our families. How many of you have a family member who thinks very different than you do politically? Thanksgiving is challenging these last couple of years, isn't it? Right? What concerns me, and what I think should concern all of us, even more than the fact that we might be so far apart in our political ideologies and beliefs, is what we are doing to each other in the process. That we are losing our civility, that we are demonizing the other. Even think about, now you may not be doing this with another person right now, but just watch when you listen to the news. If whatever you are hearing is from the other political point of view from your own, what energy do you carry when you are hearing that? Are you demonizing that other person or that whole other group of people? What I know to be true of us spiritually and emotionally is that when we demonize the other becomes, to our mind, not human. And when we look at each other as somehow not human or somehow less than, it becomes very easy to abuse and continue to perpetuate harm. We're not ever going to get to a place of moving ourselves higher toward resolution and toward kindness or peace if we stay in the energy of demonizing the other. A couple of quotes I want to share with you. This one is from Edward de Bono. The need to be right all the time is the biggest bar to new ideas. It is better to have enough ideas for some of them to be wrong than to be always right by having no ideas at all. And this one that's even more powerful from Pema Chodron. The truth you believe and cling to makes you unavailable to hear anything new. Think about that just politically right now. Wherever you are, and I don't care where you are right now. Think about that politically. The truth I believe and cling to makes me unavailable to hear anything new. And if I not only cannot hear anything new, and in the process I'm also demonizing you, then how are we ever going to get to some sort of resolution? How are we ever going to deal with the very real problems that we do have in our world? I was sharing with somebody in the cafe right after first service, and I so respected the individual. She said to me, I know when I get into some of these conversations, I can just feel the anger come out, and I don't even hear the other person anymore, and I tell them, you are wrong. She says, and I know that I'm doing that, and then I never even get a chance to hear what it is that they are trying to say. I said to her, at least you are aware of what you are doing, because if you weren't aware of that, and if you weren't aware of how your behavior is shutting you down from even hearing anything that the other might have to say, then there's no way you can make a better and different choice. And I offered this to her, and I offer it to you, and I try to practice it myself. When you find yourself in that kind of conversation, where you know you are so at opposite ends around an important issue, to ask the other this question or a question like it. How is it that you came to that conclusion? How is it that you came to that point of view? And then to listen. Because when we ask a question like that, which is different than what is your point of view, when we ask a question like, how is it that you came to believe the way that you do? And not with an accusatory tone, it doesn't work that way. A genuinely curious, how is it that you came to that point of view? I don't think it's me, but I don't care if it is. When we ask a question like that, what we get to is usually something we share in common. Because usually we share the very basic things in common. Most of us on this planet do not wake up in the morning wishing anybody else a horrible life. We don't wake up thinking it's okay for unjust situations to continue. We don't wake up thinking it's okay to take advantage of other people. We basically share some of the same genuine concerns for peace and happiness and a reduction in suffering for everyone. Is that not true? Now, how we think we get there when we hold on to that so tight and we forget to try to find what is that common ground and then how can we move forward, that's where the problems arise. You and I think, have tremendous work that we can do together. You have an opportunity today, some of you are going to take advantage of it, to join us for the living room conversation around immigration. Even if you don't come to that conversation, and it's a conversation, nobody's going to tell you what to think because it's going to be whatever people wind up sharing as their thoughts and their feelings and their personal experiences around it. But look at what a living room conversation is all about. It's about let's meet person to person and talk person to person about things that matter, even if we see them very differently. So that in the hopes of my connecting with you person to person, that maybe somehow together we can find something that will work. And that leads to the very last, and I'll wrap this up quickly. How do we get unstuck from the need to be right? How do we get unstuck from that? We have to do what I just described to you, the woman in the cafe shared with me. We have to recognize when we are latching on to being right. We have to recognize when that energy bubbles up inside of us where we are fighting desperately to convince the other that we are right and they are wrong. So we have to notice that. And then we need to stop. We literally need to take that pause point. That pause point is a point of power for each of us, truly. We need to stop for just a moment and ask ourselves silently, what's really at stake here? What's really at stake here? Is what is at stake here a life and death thing? If it is, you're going to take a different course of action than if you ask, what's at stake here? What really matters? And you get, you know what, it's two very different viewing points. Let me make sure that I approach this with my spiritual practice intact. We always have a choice to either be right or be happy. To either be right or be happy. So when it is not a life and death matter, when it really doesn't matter, then we make a choice for peace. We make a choice for the relationship. When it's in a conversation that is a deep, perhaps philosophical or political conversation, we speak what we know to be true from where we are, and we share how we arrived at that. And in sharing how we arrived at that and being open to hearing how the other arrived at a very different point of view, we may find that there's a little bit of an overlap there. And we may stop in that process of seeing that overlap, of seeing the other somehow as bad or inferior. Mahatma Gandhi said, when you are right, you have no need to be angry. When you are wrong, you have no right to be angry. He was a smart guy. And let me close with this. It's not that being right is never good. There is nothing wrong with being right. It's the need to be right all the time that is the problem and will keep us spiritually stuck. And it will separate us from each other and from God. Because if I have to be right, what do you have to be? Wrong. Namaste.
The Unity Center, spiritually progressive, socially responsive, radically inclusive. We have services on Sundays at 9 and 11. Many people enjoy Reverend Wendy's talks and meditations and aren't able to attend the Unity Center in person. If you're part of our extended family from around the world and would like to help support the Unity Center, please go to our website or download our free app, which offers even more ways to connect with the Unity Center. Namaste.